Shalom, everyone. Welcome to this special class, Thomas Jefferson. I forgot the exact title, but I didn't call it Thomas Jefferson and the Jews because it's not just going to be a history of Thomas Jefferson. I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson, a little bit about the history of Jefferson, a little bit about Thomas Jefferson's connection with the Jewish community, but I also want to give it a Torah perspective. And I'll tell you a little story behind the story, if I may. People always ask me, Rabbi, why are you so into history? I'm not really into history. I'm an amateur. People think that I'm like a historian. I'm not a historian. I love reading history. And that really started when I was in yeshiva many years ago. After a long day of studying the Talmud, you needed to wind down. So I used to grab the history books from the library and just read. And I remember and I've always loved stories, and I've always loved thinking about different historical figures as well as significant historical events and try to look at them through the lens and the filter of the Torah and giving things just like a Torah insight and Torah perspective. And tonight's class, which I'm very excited to talk about, was actually one of the first things that I ever came up with. So this goes back, I'm going to offer my little 2 cents, something that goes back probably about 25 years. So I'm really excited. If this is your first time at the Kollel, I want to welcome you, and I'm going to ask you to please come over after the class. I'd love to meet you, get to know who you are. If this is not your first time at the Kollel, thank you for coming back. Thanks for coming. And everyone's always encouraged and invited to come to all the Kollel's classes, programs, and events. Thomas Jefferson is the most complicated person in American history, period, hard stop. He is really complicated. As a matter of fact, Joseph Ellis's biography on Jefferson is called American Sphinx. What was the Sphinx? He was, that statue that was on the air. It gave you all those riddles that you couldn't figure out. Jefferson was really complicated. He's a mix of contradictions. One of my favorite books on history, this book by Paul Johnson. Johnson writes, in some ways, he was a mass of contradictions, and he lists all of the weird complications, the contradictions about Jefferson. The 2 biggest questions, conundrums that historians all wrestle with when they try to understand Thomas Jefferson, they always revolve around 2 things. They always revolve around 2 things. I'm going to go out of order of what my notes say. So I'm going to go in order of complexity. Jefferson was vehemently against slavery. As a matter of fact, one of his he never really wrote a book, but he did publish many essays. And probably one of the essays he was most proud of, and of the most influential things he ever wrote, was called his Notes on the State of Virginia. And I'm going to read a little passage that Paul Johnson writes. He hated slavery, feared it, reviled it, privately at least, and sought in vain both to curtail it publicly and to cut it out of his own life. His Notes on the State of Virginia is such an outspoken denunciation of slavery on almost every ground that he told James Monroe that he hesitated to publish it because the terms in which I speak of slavery and our Constitution in Virginia may produce an irritation which will revolt the minds of our countrymen against the reform of these 2 articles and thus do more harm than good. He argued that slavery was not just an economic evil which destroyed industry, but a moral one which degraded the slave owners even more than the slave. Now that's progressive, coming from Thomas Jefferson. Yet, Thomas Jefferson, his entire life, bought, sold, bred slaves. His entire life. He generally didn't break up families by selling them, but every now and again he would. Oh, but didn't he free his slaves on his death? Misnomer, he did not. He emancipated 1 slave and their family, and we'll get to that, why that happened. But here you have a man who's one of the most outspoken critics of slavery. As a matter of fact, if you read the Declaration of Independence, authored by our good friend Thomas Jefferson, in his long list, the part that you skip when you read the Declaration of Independence, the part that you skip where he lists all the evils that King George brought to the United States and all of the horrible things that he did, he lists he was responsible for bringing slavery to these shores. And of course, all the other people in the South They didn't like that because that's acknowledging that there's something wrong about slavery. But Jefferson hated slavery. Yet at the same time, he bought, owned, bred. At any typical moment on his plantation, he usually had hundreds, usually 200 slaves. How could that be? Jefferson, that's contradiction number one. Jefferson, number two, was a moralist, a high moralist. Man was destined for society. His morality, therefore, this is Jefferson's own words, was to be formed to this object. He was endowed with the sense of right and wrong, merely relative to this. The sense is as much a part of his nature as the sense of hearing, seeing, and feeling. It is the true foundation of morality. I sincerely then believe with you in the general existence of a moral instinct. I think it the brightest gem with which the human character is studied, and the want of it as more degrading than the most hideous of the bodily deformities. Jefferson was a moralist, a high moralist. If you brought Thomas Jefferson back to life today, every historian would ask one question of Thomas Jefferson. One question that they want to know. Did you do it? Guilty or not guilty? What are they talking about? His affair with Sally Hemings. If you study Thomas Jefferson, we're going to get to this a little bit later on, but Sally Hemings was one of Jefferson's slaves. She was brought when Jefferson was in Paris, in France. He serves as a minister to France in the 1780s. And his daughter, I always forget which one, I believe it's Patsy. When Patsy was brought, Patsy was back in the United States. At a certain point, Jefferson really missed Patsy, so he had her sent transatlantic to France, and brought with her was a nurse to take care of her. Wasn't really much of a nurse, basically the same age. Her name was Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was one of Jefferson's slaves. At this point, Jefferson was a bachelor. His wife had died. Jefferson, according to most, the rumors that were published in the papers and have been speculated for the last many, many hundreds of years, was that Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings over the course of many, many decades, 40 years, and fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings. Did he or didn't he? Yes, no. It's never really denied, but how do you prove such a thing? The answer is DNA testing. It has been proven, and the Sally Hemings descendants all have Jefferson DNA. Now, you could argue maybe it was Jefferson's brother. Maybe it was a different Jefferson. Highly doubtful, as all of Sally Hemings' kids looked exactly like Thomas Jefferson. So here you have a man who's a moralist, talks about morality being the definition of humanity, and he lives with this slave, has an affair with her for 40 years. Now, again, he wasn't a married man, but was certainly out of wedlock. It certainly was taboo in some circles. How do you have a man who's such a strong moralist living such an immoral life? You ever go to the Library of Congress? You've heard of the Library of Congress? Housed in the Thomas Jefferson building. Why is it called? I believe it's what it's called. Well, there are a couple of buildings. Why? The Library of Congress was first founded, actually, if I recall correctly, it was one of Jefferson's initiatives. But when the English invaded during the War of 1812, they burnt down, if you recall, they burnt down D.C., they burnt down the White House, part of the Capitol, and they also burnt the Library of Congress. So the Library of Congress, all the books were burnt in 1814 with the British invasion. Jefferson, in 1814, donates his books from Monticello. He had a beautiful library, and he donated, or sold actually, he didn't donate them, he sold many of his books to the Library of Congress. So the Library of Congress, which we know and love today, is really based on the Jefferson Library. It's basically a Jeffersonian idea. The library's first collection that we have is from Jefferson's library. Why did Jefferson sell it to the Library of Congress? The answer is because Jefferson was broke. Jefferson was broke beyond broke. You ever go to Monticello? It's beautiful. I've seen pictures of it. Haven't been there. His estate down in Charlottesville, it's beautiful. He ran a budget deficit virtually his entire life. But here's the startling thing. Jefferson never even realized just how broke he was. He was that guy that had no idea how much debt he had. He couldn't balance his checkbook. He had no idea he owed money to this guy, that guy, and the third guy. You ever meet a person like that? They can't keep track. Credit card bill, paying off this debt with that debt. No clue what was going on in his life financially. Right? You ever meet a person like that? A little bit, as they say in French, souffligen, just a little bit, right? Couldn't keep track of anything. Yet, Thomas Jefferson had the most scientific of minds. If there ever was a genius, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail a little bit later, Jefferson was brilliant and had a brilliant mind, particularly loving science. He was a note taker. He kept track of everything, of every detail under the sun. I believe it's still in Monticello. You can see his lists that he wrote down every day, the weather, wind direction, the air pressure. And just in case those copies got destroyed, he developed what was called a polygraph, not like the lie detector test, but he had a polygraph machine, which is basically a photocopier for the late 1700s and the early 1800s, where if he would write one thing, it would be written down on multiple copies. He kept records and he filed them, and all of his letters, he was an amazing letter writer. He kept duplicates and filed them and sorted them in perfect meticulous order. He had a device on his carriage that he contrived. He made up some wacky device. He was curious how many axle rotations every time his carriage would ride, his carriage would go. He wanted to know how many wheel rotations of the axle on his carriage. So he invented a device to do that, and he used to record those rotations. So here you have a man who's keeping track. Anyone know what the barometric pressure is right now outside in Las Vegas? No, because no one cares about this kind of stuff. And even if you did, you certainly wouldn't be recording it. Jefferson was that guy. Wheel rotations, temperature, everything, all in beautiful notebooks. Yet he can't balance his checkbook? How do you explain a guy like this? And the list goes on and on and on of these contradictions in Thomas Jefferson's life. In tonight's class, I'd like to get back to that, try to explain, using a Torah perspective, how we can reconcile some of those contradictions, as well as answer even some more troubling questions that come to how Thomas Jefferson's life, particularly his approach and view of religion, which is going to be very relevant to some of us, and maybe talk a little bit about Jefferson and his connection with the Jewish community and his brief sketch biography of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was born April 13th, 1743 in Shadwell Plantation in Virginia, third child of 10. His father, Peter Jefferson, was, we think, of Welsh descent. He was a planter and surveyor, died when Jefferson was only 14 years old. His mother, was Jane Randolph. Jefferson inherited a huge, 5,000 acres, including his future home on top of a hill, which would be his prize and his most cherished thing in his life, his home, which was called Monticello, which means little mountain. He enters the College of William and Mary in 1761, studies law under George Wythe. He would become a practicing lawyer. He never really liked practicing law. He liked the concepts of law. He liked studying law. He didn't really love practicing it. Jefferson was a very, very quiet man. He was a very poor orator. He did not like public speaking. As a matter of fact, at both of his inaugurals, no one could hear him except the people who were sitting in the first row. He was a very soft-spoken person. His pen, on the other hand, was the greatest pen in the history of the United States of America. But he was a very quiet person. He didn't really like practicing law because that means getting up in front of people and arguing one way or another. That said, he did take 7 cases early on in his career of freedom-seeking slaves. And at one point, again, going back to his hatred of slavery, he invoked natural law, arguing everyone comes into the world with a fight of his own person, using it at his own will. This is what is called personal liberty, and is given him by the author of nature because it is necessary for his own sustenance. Again, Jefferson hates slavery, but owned, bred, and sold slaves. 1768, when he begins work on Monticello, it never really finished. He would spend his whole life tinkering with, remodeling, redesigning Monticello. It would only be at the end of his life that he'd actually enjoy enjoy his house, which wasn't just a beautiful house, but was also a huge plantation, again, where there were slaves working. And if you've been to Monticello, I think you could see the slave quarters and all the things. I think he was always trying to turn a profit there, always unsuccessful. In 1772, Jefferson marries his third cousin, a distant cousin. Her name was Martha Wales Skelton. She was a widow. She had married some guy. They had a very short marriage, and then she was a widow. He marries her. She's 23 years old. They had 10 years. From all accounts, they had actually a very happy marriage. He was a very, very devoted husband, as he was a very devoted father. Sometimes he was a little harsh and a little distant, but he was an extremely devoted grandfather. There are touching vignettes of him with his grandchildren. During their 10 years of marriage, Martha bore 6 children. However, 4 of them were to die, wouldn't make it through childhood. Only 2 would really survive. Martha's known as Patsy, Mary's known as, so it's really Patsy and Polly would be his 2 daughters who would survive. Martha's father dies in 1773, and Jefferson inherits a huge swath of land as well as 135 slaves. And that's really where slavery begins to really explode in Jefferson's life. But Martha dies in 1780, something like that, like in the middle of the war, and the Revolutionary War. And as she lay dying, story goes, legend goes, I think it's true, is that she kind of asked Jefferson never to marry again, a promise which he kept. He would never remarry, he'd be a bachelor the rest of his life. He was devastated when she died. People were concerned for his life. Beginning in 1774, Jefferson, who's still a young man, he wrote he's now in Virginia. He's, a prominent person in Virginia. He wrote a resolution calling for a day of fasting and prayer, and a boycott of all British goods as a result of the intolerable acts. If you remember what was going on in New England and the British and all their annoying acts to try to tax the colonists. And he would write this resolution. Was later expanded into a book that was called, into a pamphlet, which he published, called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. British America being the colonies. This was widely popularized around the country. He argued there that people have the right to govern themselves. He wrote harshly against slavery. And in 1775, he was elected to serve as a delegate on the Second Continental Congress. Again, if you think about it, just a quick review of your American history. In 1775, there is no such thing as the United States. There are 13 separate colonies. They have a couple of continental congresses, and the most significant being the Second Continental Congress, where they decide that they want their freedom. Of course, it was Jefferson who in 1776, he's chosen together with John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, the Committee of 5. They are tasked, as the country realizes, or as the delegates realize, it's the colonies are going for independence. That's just the direction that they're going. So they task these 5, the Committee of 5, to write the Declaration of Independence. Of course, we know Jefferson is the primary author. He wrote the overwhelming majority of it. Adams and Franklin would make a couple of amendments. It then went, of course, how does it go? It went to committee. It went to the full delegation of the Continental Congress. They struck about a third of it. They got rid of about a third of it, broke Jefferson's heart. He still never forgave them. He was so upset. Like, all right, any writer hates his editors, and they start, get rid of this, get rid of that, and the other thing. He hated them for that. And of course, the Declaration of Independence, it really is Thomas Jefferson's work. I would argue, in my opinion, it's the greatest work ever written in English. Just of its literary style, its argument, it is the greatest document ever written in English. It is amazing. If you haven't read the Declaration of Independence in the last couple of years, read it again. It is awe-inspiring. The beauty of that pen is one step away from divine. It is just amazing. Really, really a remarkable letter. He never fought in the army. Him and Adams would be the 2 real founding fathers. They really never were fought. But he was elected governor of Virginia in 1779. In 1780, while he's the governor of Virginia, Benedict Arnold, who you might recall, he's the turncoat. He invades Virginia. And Jefferson, and they want to attack Richmond. Jefferson has to run from his life from Richmond. And then later, a few months later, Bannister Tarleton, who's one of the real villains, if you remember your Revolutionary War history, one of the real villains of the British, he was a not good guy. He actually was sent on a mission to capture Jefferson, because of course Jefferson's the author of the Declaration. They wanted to hang him. And they went to Monticello. And Jefferson escaped about 5 minutes to spare. He got out of there. Now the British, not really so clear why, they were actually very gentle. They did not destroy Monticello. That would have been very understandable had they did. They just helped themselves to some wine from the cellar. Interestingly, the Virginia Assembly would later call an inquiry. They didn't quite censure Jefferson, but they definitely called a committee of inquiry to try to figure out why did Jefferson not call up the militia to defend Virginia. He never did. Now the reason why he didn't is because there were always on again, off again reports, and every 2 minutes he'd be calling up the militia. It wasn't practical. But he was so resentful of that. That was something he never forgave. In the 1780s, he actually, if you rewind the clock, he wrote something called Virginia was rewriting their own constitution. He wrote a document called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It's drafted in 1777. The statute disestablished the Church of England in Virginia and guaranteed freedom of religion to people of all religious faiths, including Christians of all denominations, Jews, Muslims, and Hindus. You ever heard the expression, the separation of church and state, right? Right? Found in the Constitution, right? That term is not found in the Constitution. Trick question. I caught you all. That term is not found in the Constitution. The concept, First Amendment, is obviously in the First Amendment, in the Constitution. The term separation of church and state is actually Jeffersonian. He was the one who coined that term of a separation of church and state, and he was the driving force with his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedoms, that document where he vociferously argued that there should be a separation of church and state, and it was him, he was the powerhouse to the First Amendment, rights, which we all love and practice, and has really been, such a generous act of unimaginable freedom that Jews have never had in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. We owe that we owe that largely to Thomas Jefferson. Interesting, if you ever look at his tombstone, which is in Monticello, it's a very, very simple, it's one of those funny obelisks, but the epitaph is very short. It's like, here lies Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration. He wrote it. It says the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the founder of Virginia. We'll see in a little bit. He establishes the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Those were what he felt were his three greatest accomplishments and contributions to mankind, one of them being the separation of church and state. After the war, he was elected by the Confederate Congress. Again, this is before the Constitution, and there's a lag between after the Revolutionary War, between then and when the United States becomes the United States. Before the Constitution becomes the Constitution. He was sent by the Continental, or at this point, the Confederate Congress. He's sent to France, where he would stay for several years as a minister to France. While he's in France, it's actually one of the forgotten little pieces of American history, you have the all-star team is hanging out in France. You have Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, who's a celebrity. He's like paparazzi are chasing him around. And John Adams. It's at this point where John Adams and Thomas Jefferson kind of live together. They're in very close quarters. As a matter of fact, I mentioned Patsy would be raised functionally by Abigail Adams, and John Quincy Adams would look at Thomas Jefferson almost as an avuncular figure, as almost like his uncle. They became very, very, very tight and close during those years while they were all serving as ministers in Europe. Adams would eventually go to England, but they were very, very close, which is going to be that much more heartbreaking when that relationship blows up. Jefferson was not part of the framing of the Constitution. He was back in the United States, although he had Madison, as his protege kind of filling him in, but it was, again, cross the Atlantic. So he was always like several weeks, if not months behind. Of course, Washington becomes president, and Jefferson becomes Washington's Secretary of State. While Adams is the vice president. Now, one of the great things that happens, we've spoke about this before, and again, I am the last guy, even though I love American history, I am the last guy. I have not seen Hamilton the musical. So some of you said you were going to sing it. I don't know it. I couldn't even sing the songs together with you. I never saw it, so I don't know. You'll forgive me. I don't know what part of the Jefferson and Hamilton stories are in popular culture and is just, oh, Rabbi, we all know that. That was like the main point of the musical. I don't know, so I apologize in advance. But one of the big things that happened when under Washington's administration, Washington didn't really belong to a political party, but it was under Washington's administration that things began separating and going in different directions. You had a split between people they were called the Federalists. Largely speaking, these were people from the North, the Hamiltons, the Adams, who really wanted industry and wanted a stronger central government. And then you had the people from the South, states' rights, agriculture. They were more focused in that direction. That would eventually be led by Jefferson, who would eventually become the leader of the opposition and would functionally start his own party called the Democratic Republicans. Not confusing to us. It's not the Democratic Party, started a couple of decades later by Jackson, nor is it the Republican Party, started a century later by Lincoln. This is a Democratic Republican Party, sort of its own independent party. In 1790, it's a year into Washington's administration, the country almost fell apart. The rift between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, would be the Democratic Republicans. It really, one of the big issues that was tearing apart the country was the assumption issue. Remember the assumption issue? Many of the states, if you think about it, during the Revolutionary War, they were independent countries. Many of them had war debts. Some of them did not. After the war, who has to pay off all these debts that each of the states had, varying amounts of debts? Who's responsible to pay these things off? So the Democratic Republicans, the Anti-Federalists, were like, if you borrow the money, you pay it back. Each state has to deal with it on their own. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who would turn into, it's strong to call him the nemesis or foe. It is again, Jefferson and Hamilton would really be on the polar ends of the political spectrum, as far apart as could be. Hamilton felt that if the federal government didn't assume the state's debts, the states would just economically crumble and the United States would be stillborn. And Hamilton believed that. Hamilton was, of course, the economic whiz kid of Washington. He really felt that this was the issue, and he was right. This was the issue that the entire Union hinged on. The Torah tells us such an important lesson. You learn in the Torah. Talmud really highlights this. Verse tells us, "V'asisa hayashar v'hatov." You should do that which is yashar, that which is straight, that which is correct. V'hatov, and that which is good. Well, which one is it? Do I do what's good or do what's right? Sometimes what's good and what's right aren't necessarily aligned. Talmud tells us, Rashi quotes it, this is a reference to the concept that when you have litigants, when people are in dispute, when two people can't see eye to eye, you should seek pshara. What is pshara? Compromise. Compromise. Something that I think the political discord in the United States today could learn a lesson or two from. You can't have everything your way all the time. If you want to play with the teddy bear, that's great. But there's another kid in the class that also wants to play with the teddy bear. How are we going to work out this problem? So let's work out a way to share, a way to compromise. You both can't have the teddy bear. And if one child gets the teddy bear, the other child is going to be unhappy. So we work out compromises. And that's what wise civil people do. They realize, I feel strongly about my positions. I feel strongly about my beliefs. But I have to know in what areas, if I'm going to die on every political hill, you're not being reasonable. You have to learn how to compromise. And it's true about politics, and it's true about in all of our relationships. We have to know how to compromise. And that's what the Torah teaches us. You have to know how to make compromises. Hamilton and Jefferson couldn't be farther apart on the political spectrum. But number one, they always treated each other with civility. If you go to Monticello today, I think it's still there today, you will see a bust of Hamilton, together with busts of, some of the key people during the period of the Revolution. Now, here you have a man, Jefferson, who couldn't stand Hamilton politically, but understood and respected him. He recognized he was a wise person. And they met. He saw Hamilton frazzled. The story goes, he saw him frazzled one night. Hamilton was a very put together, well-kept kind of guy, but one day he sees Hamilton in the streets all disheveled, and he says, "What's wrong?" And he says, this assumption thing is going to destroy the country. So he said, "Let's go do dinner." And at dinner in D.C., they came up with a compromise. Hamilton really felt the assumption thing was so critical. Jefferson, if you think about it, it's the late 1790. Where was the United States Capitol in 1790? New York. Up north. Where's Jefferson from? Down south. He doesn't want the capital up north. He said, how about this? There was big talks about relocating the capital. He really felt it would be great for it to be on the banks of the Potomac. Right in the middle. I'm from D.C. D.C., it's not north, it's not south. Anyone ever been to D.C.? The culture of Washington, D.C. it's the most unique city of the most unique cities in the country. It's not north, it's not south. It's D.C. It's its own little thing. It's hard to really, put it into a category. Jefferson said, "I will get you the votes on the Assumption Bill if you get me the votes on moving the capital to the banks of the Potomac." V'kachava. That's what happened. And two things happened. Washington, D.C. is located on the banks of the Potomac, and the federal government assumed the state debts, and the country continued. Isn't that amazing? Two people, polar opposite views of the world, were able to figure things out. He would resign his post as Secretary of State in 1793. He really was the opposition. He knew it wouldn't work. He would be elected vice president under John Adams, who he also disagreed sharply with. And it would be during Adams' tenure, Jefferson was, this is back then, the way the election worked is the president was the person who got the most votes. Pretty not wisely, the Constitution says, who's the vice president? What does the Constitution say? The actual Constitution says it's the person who gets the second most votes, which means you can have Trump president, Harris vice president, right? Wouldn't that be great? That's what happened in 1796. It was crazy. That was until the 12th Amendment came along and changed that, because the second and third, the election of 1796 and the election of 1800, they realized this is not a good system. So Jefferson would be Adams' vice president. They did not get along. And again, Adams being more of a Federalist, even though he didn't get along with Hamilton either, he was a Federalist. They got into a fight with Jefferson. They wouldn't talk for another 15 years. Adams wouldn't even go to Jefferson's inauguration. He becomes president in 1800. His vice president was Aaron Burr, the murderer. That's got to be in the musical, right? They talk about that guy? Now, it's actually an interesting story. Do you know the story about the election of 1800? Okay, we don't have time, but we'll go through it real quick. The election of 1800, again, because of this funny thing, the way if you're in the electoral college, you cast your vote. Now, the problem is you cast your vote, but you might end up, because you didn't have a separate vote for the vice president, you can have a scenario where someone who is clearly intended to be the vice president could end up being the president. And that's what happened. Burr ended up getting the same amount of votes as Jefferson. They both got 70 votes. And it wouldn't be until, did they talk about this in the musical? I don't know. In any event, it had to go to the Congress, and on the 36th ballot, it ended up being that the Congress voted Jefferson the president. Who was the one who petitioned Jefferson to be the president? Funny, oddly enough, it was Hamilton. Did they talk about it in the movie, in the musical? It was Hamilton. Why? Because Hamilton understood the only thing worse than Jefferson was Burr. Hamilton may have been opposite in political views, but they all respected one another. They knew each other, that he was a mensch. He could be trusted, and his character was immaculate. Aaron Burr was a scoundrel. So he'd rather have the guy who's on the other end of the political spectrum be the president than have a scoundrel at the spectrum, and that cost Hamilton his life because Burr would kill him. In his presidency, as president, Jefferson, let's talk about some of the things that happened in Jefferson's presidency. You're right, history, right, as Twain, we talked about this on top, Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Isn't it funny? The United States had a hard time dealing with Arab nations not behaving according to international norms, right? That's the story of Jefferson in 1801 or 1801. What happened? The Barbary pirates, remember the story? The Barbary pirates off the coast of Tripoli would, after the United States broke away from England, they no longer had the protection of the British Navy. They no longer had the protection of the British Navy. So the Barbary pirates used to raid the American boats and take all their stuff, hostage and hold them for ransom. And Jefferson didn't like that. So he raised money for the Navy, and they would invade Tripoli. Hence, we did this in the Grant class. That's the hulls of Montezuma, and this is the shores of Tripoli. If you know of any Marines here, Semper Fi, that's in the Marine Marching Song. That was the first war ever declared by the United States of America. The other big thing internationally, it's a little international, a little domestic as well, of course, would be in 1800, Spain ceded ownership of the Louisiana territories, basically the Mississippi River Basin, which is a huge part of this wonderful country. They ceded it to France. Jefferson was concerned that Napoleon's interest in the vast territory would threaten the security of the continent and the Mississippi River. As Jefferson said, whoever controls New Orleans controls the United States. The New Orleans is the mouth of the Mississippi. That's where you get stuff to a huge part of the United States. Napoleon, who was a little crazy, went back and forth and back and forth. Napoleon realized, and Jefferson wanted to buy he sent people to France to buy New Orleans, all right? They got quite a bargain. They didn't just get New Orleans, but of course, what did they get? The whole Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon, people think it was crazy. It's actually something fascinating to think about. They would sell the entire, it's a huge part of the United States. They sold $15 million. Translate that to today's dollars, about $300 million, right? Less than 4 cents an acre. It was the greatest, real estate purchase in the history of mankind. It actually wasn't a bad deal for Napoleon because he would have lost it anyway. So he got $15 million out of the deal. Jefferson, again, yet another one of his contradictions. He believed that buying Louisiana, and again, the whole Mississippi Valley, buying it from the French, he believed it was unconstitutional. He believed he didn't have the right to do it, but he did it anyway. Why? Because he wanted to. Why? Because Thomas Jefferson was a complicated guy. Of course, he would be the one who would send Meriwether Clark, the Lewis and Clark expedition, to really discover. It's really the most amazing stories in its own right. In his second term, Napoleon becomes more aggressive in his negotiations over trading rights. France gets into a war with Great Britain, and France and Great Britain really want to, they want to blockade one another, and the United States, Jefferson really wants to declare his neutrality. And first, during Adams' reign, while Adams was president, they almost got into what was called the quasi-war with France. Here they got into it would end up being a real war with Great Britain, but that wouldn't be for till under Madison's watch. But while the Great Britain and France were fighting, the United States wanted to stay neutral, and they had a very hard time doing that. And Jefferson would pass what's called the Embargo Act, which basically cut shipping to France and England, and it really, really, really hurt many, many people, and Jefferson had many, many death threats. He would eventually, again, he leaves the presidency. Madison would take over. He would retire back to Monticello, where we talked about a couple of weeks ago how Benjamin Rush argued, wouldn't it be a shame if the two of you, Adams and Jefferson, were to die without ever reconciling? They loved one another, but hated one another yet the same. How could that be? The answer is that's true about almost every relationship in your life. The people you love the most are probably people that frustrate you the most as well. They learned how to get over it, which is an amazing lesson. We talked about that at the explanatory service, which happens every Shabbos morning at 9:45 a.m. Remember, we talked about the reconciliation between Adams and Jefferson. That's a story in its own right, and it's very, very inspiring, at least to me. You see that you can get into fights with people, and you can have busted relationships, and you can reconcile. That's the story of Jefferson and Adams. They would end up writing to one another, and it's the greatest correspondence in American history. We also talked about when does Jefferson die? Remarkably, he dies on July 4th, 1826, the same day as John Adams, put there by God, in my opinion. Again, he builds the University of Virginia in the last couple of years of his life. But Jefferson, as we talked about earlier, he died in complete poverty, not complete poverty, I want to say that, in complete debt, was unable to pass on his estate freely to his heirs. He gave instructions in his will for disposal of his assets, including the freeing of one slave in her family, Sally Hemings. Let's just talk about that for a second. When Jefferson was in France, he brought Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was there. Most people believe that's when the affair began. Now, according to French law, Sally Hemings became free if she stayed in France for more than 2 years, which she did. So technically, Sally Hemings and her brother, I think it's John Hemings, could petition France for their manumission, and they would have received it. It seemed, the theory that most people speculate, probably true, is that Jefferson bartered, or not bartered, that's not the right word, came up with an agreement with Sally that if she comes back with him to Monticello, he will free her children, and she'll be able to live nicely, not quite as a slave. And that was true. That is what ended up happening. He freed Sally Hemings and her children, who were probably Thomas Jefferson's children. All of her 6 children, we can date. Historians will all tell you, isn't it interesting? They're all born 9 months after, Jefferson would be going back and forth between DC and Monticello. They were all born 9 months exactly after Jefferson made it back to Monticello. So he did free her. Now, Jefferson, and that's the story of Jefferson. Now, Jefferson did have a couple of interactions with Jews during his time. As we've talked about in the past, during the time of the Revolution, there's maybe 2,500, 3,000 Jews in all the United States. There were a handful of Jews in Virginia, very few Jews in Charlottesville, although they wouldn't have a shul, a congregation, not until well into the 50s, 1860s, so there was no synagogue in Charlottesville. However, there was a synagogue in Richmond, Kal Kadosh. I forget what it's called. Kal Kadosh something. Oh, come on. I forgot what it's called. But there was a congregation in Richmond. He had many letters of Jefferson. As I mentioned, he was a prolific writer. We have many letters that he wrote to prominent Jews, including David Salisbury Franks, who we've talked about in other groups, or in this class in the past. Who was David Salisbury Franks? He was Benedict Arnold's right-hand man. But he was not a turncoat, and he demanded a court-martial to prove his innocence, which he was found innocent. He wrote some letters to a fellow named, I thought this was interesting, a fellow named Dr. John D. Secura, who was Jewish. And Jefferson was intrigued by Secura because he was the person, this Jewish doctor, who introduced the tomato as being an edible food in the United States of America. He wrote a letter to Isaac Harvey, who not for now, we could give a whole class on Isaac Harvey. Harvey was one of the leaders of the early Reformation, early Jewish reform experiment in Charleston. And Jefferson wrote the following note, which I think is charming or interesting. He said, "I'm a little antiquated with the liturgy of the Jews or their mode of worship. I have thought it a cruel addition to the wrongs which that the injured sect have suffered that their youths should be excluded from the instructions in science afforded to all others in our public seminaries by imposing on them a course of theological reading which their consciences do not permit them to pursue." Telling him, I don't think it's fair that you have to go to school and have to study Christianity. Now, one of the most interesting Jewish connections between Jefferson, with Jefferson and the Jews, would be a fellow named David Isaacs. David Isaacs was a German Jewish immigrant. He immigrates to the United States in 1793, and he owns a store in Richmond. It looks like to me, it sounds like he had some, I don't know, like a dry goods store of sorts. We have records of him selling a horse named Tecumseh to Jefferson, sold him some twine that he used to measure out different tracts of land on the University of Virginia, as well as some cheese, which is the last thing that Jefferson records to have purchased before his death. Now, follow this for a second. I thought this was remarkable. I got this. There's an amazing video that actually the historians in Monticello put together less than a year ago, where they did it's on YouTube. It's an amazing video. I want to give thanks to the docent named Olivia. I didn't catch her last name, but she went through a lot of the Monticello connections to the Jewish community, and she did research on this fellow David Isaacs, which is remarkable. David Isaacs marries a woman named Nancy West. Who is Nancy West? She is the daughter of a fellow named Thomas West, who Isaacs was the executive of his will. Nancy West's mother was a slave. So Nancy West was black. She was emancipated, which means David Isaacs, this Jewish immigrant from Germany, marries a black woman who used to be a slave. It gets weirder. Mulatto, thank you. One of their children, who be named Julia Ann Isaacs, married a fellow named Eston Hemmings. Who is Eston Hemmings? A son of Sally Hemings, which means that David Isaacs' daughter married, in all probability, Thomas Jefferson's son, which, if you're following, makes Thomas Jefferson a mechutin with David Isaacs, if you know what that means. It's actually true. He had a Jewish mechutin, if that's correct, and it's unbelievable. Now, of course, you can't talk about Jefferson and the Jews in Monticello without talking about the Levy family. Uriah Phillips Levy served in the United States Navy. He'd be the first Jewish commodore of the Navy. Yes, it was Levy who helped found Kal Kadosh Beth Shalom, I believe. His grandfather, Jonas Phillips, fought in the American Revolution. He was cousins with Manuel Noah, and we don't have time. I think we read this in a different class, but actually, Uriah Levy's father got married in the presence of Benjamin Rush. Who is Benjamin Rush? He was one of the most significant. He's the signer of the Declaration. He was the one that brought the reconciliation between Adams and Jefferson. And Benjamin Rush leaves the most charming anecdote about what a Jewish wedding looks like, in colonial America. I got to read a part of it because it's just so cute. Let's see. Oh, I might not have it in here. All right, well, hold on. It's worth it. He writes that he doesn't understand everything it's going on in Hebrew. He can't follow it. I apologize. At 1 o'clock, the company consisting of 30 or 40 men assembled in Mr. Phillips' common parlor, which was accommodated with benches for this purpose. The ceremony began with the prayers in the Hebrew language, which was chanted by an old rabbi. It wasn't a rabbi, but that's fine. And in which he was followed by the whole company. I did not understand a word, except now and then an amen and hallelujah. My attention was directed to the haste, which they covered their heads with their hats as soon as the prayers began. They had to put their yarmulkes on. And to the freedom which some of them conversed with each other during the whole time of this part of their worship, meaning there was talking during davening back in the 1700s. As soon as these prayers were ended, which took about 20 minutes, a small piece of parchment was produced, written in Hebrew, which contained a deed of settlement, and which the groom subscribed in the presence of 4 witnesses. What's that called? The ksuba. The ceremony was followed by the erection of a beautiful canopy, chuppah, composed of white and red silk in the middle of the floor. As soon as this canopy was fixed, the bride, accompanied by her mother and a long train of female relations, came downstairs. Her face covered her body. Okay, another prayer was followed. The groom, after sipping some wine, took the glass in his hand and threw it upon a large pewter dish, which was suddenly placed at his feet. Upon its breaking into a number of small pieces, there was a general shout of joy. If you've ever been to an Orthodox wedding, that's exactly what it looks like. It's unbelievable. Benjamin Rush describing the chuppah, describing the wedding ceremony of Uriah Levy's parents. It's just, I think that's one of the most amazing pieces of American Jewish history. Uriah Levy would, as I mentioned, after Jefferson's death, Jefferson's estate was completely bankrupt. Uriah Levy would functionally buy Monticello. He was a Jefferson file. He loved Jefferson. He bought the Monticello and bought its estate. There's all sorts of stories. Apparently, there's a docuseries or documentary that's just been put out by that. On his death, he donated Monticello to the United States government. So if you go to Monticello, now he lived there for many years, where he did own slaves for quite a while. If you go to Monticello, it's because of it's there and preserved because of the Levy family, a Jew. Which brings us back to trying to grapple with Thomas Jefferson. A 1985 poll of members of the Senate showed that both conservatives and liberal members alike regarded Jefferson as their favorite hero. Again, times may have changed. But throughout history, he's been considered the great hero of American history. The greatest presidential quote ever was at 1962, a dinner of 49 Nobel laureates are gathered at the White House. President John F. Kennedy was talking about he's got 49 Nobel laureates, Nobel Prize winners. They're doing dinner. And JFK quipped that the event was the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever gathered at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. That actually is true. Jefferson was brilliant. Jefferson was beyond brilliant. You know, it's hard to fathom just how smart Jefferson was. He's riddled with contradictions and complexities. As a Jew, as a religious Jew, what makes it so much more complicated is that Jefferson his religious views were very, very complex, and they certainly were dynamic. They changed over the course of his lifetime. He was at best a deist. He was accused of being an atheist. I doubt he was an atheist in the sense that he probably did believe in a God of creation, but he definitely did not really believe in a God of history. He certainly, there's the Jefferson Bible for a different class. He basically rewrote the Bible according to what he thought, it should be. He certainly didn't believe in any of the miracles of the Bible. As I mentioned many years ago, I was studying when I first opened up my books in American history, and I started getting into history. I'll never forget, it was around the same time I was studying Thomas Jefferson. And I read this book. It's a little book called Kovetz Ma'amarim, which means a collection of essays written by Rabbi Chanan Bunam Wasserman. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was murdered by the Nazis, and he was a Gaon Atzum. He was a man of just incredible Talmudic scholarship. His works are studied in yeshivas all the time. Classic. He wrote this small essay, which is an essay on morality, on Musar, on religious topics as well. He was just to put it into context historically, if you've been we gave a class not too long ago about the Chafetz Chaim. Remember the great Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan? He was one of his great, if not great student, would be Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, was a great student of the Chafetz Chaim. And I'll never forget, I was studying this work, Kovetz Ma'amarim, and Rabbi Chanan Wasserman functionally asks, and I'm just going to update it and plagiarize, but I'm not plagiarizing, I'm quoting Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. I'm going to ask a question that he asks in different terms, but it's the same question holds. Now, the Rambam writes the first mitzvah, not chronologically, but academically, structurally. The first mitzvah is Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher tzeisecha me'eretz Mitzrayim. We have to believe I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. We have to believe that there's a God, not just the God of creation, but Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We believe that God is not just creating the world. He didn't just create the world and walk away, but we believe in a God of history. We believe in the Torah. We believe that God has a plan and is intimately involved in the affairs of mankind, that there's an objective right and wrong, and that there's responsibility for our actions. Ani mamin be'emunah shalema, I believe with complete faith. This is the basics 101. The first thing in Judaism is we have to believe that. Now, who's obligated to believe in that? If you're Jewish, the answer is everyone. Which means a bar mitzvah boy or a bat mitzvah girl, the day she turns 12, the day he turns 13, is expected and required to believe, Ani mamin be'emunah shalema, you are expected to believe in God. Now, asks Rabbi Wasserman, how does that make sense? You have brilliant people throughout the history of mankind who have struggled acknowledging that there's a God. Aristotle, Rabbi Wasserman points out. I would argue, how do we deal with Jefferson? How do I expect my children, little Bennies, turning bar mitzvah in a year? And I have an expectation, a hope and a prayer, but there's an expectation in Judaism that little Benny Meth believes in God. How do I expect? Now, I'm a proud dad, and I know I'm a biased dad, but I'm able to see past my bias. I'm able to see I think he's really, really smart. He's brilliant. He's probably not as smart as Thomas Jefferson. Maybe he is. I don't know. How do I expect? How is it reasonable to expect Benny Meth at 13 years old to come to the acknowledgement that there is a God, there is a Borei Olam, there's a Kadosh Baruch Hu, God is involved in the affairs of mankind. God created the world, and he's involved in the affairs of mankind. If Thomas Jefferson, the most brilliant man to ever step foot on these shores, he was uncomfortable with it. How do we understand? If you really think about that, is a very fundamental question in Judaism. Rabbi Wasserman answers and explains, and this is of the most fundamental ideas in all of humanity. It is certainly the most fundamental idea in understanding human psychology, in my opinion. Quotes the verse in the Torah. Verse in the Torah says, you're a judge sitting on a court case, Torah tells us, lo sikach shochad, you can't take bribery. Meaning, if let's say Reuven and Shimon are in a court case, Reuven gives me $1. He says, you don't have to, rule in my favor. I just want to give you $1. Thank you very much. Do whatever you want. You are not allowed to accept that. What do you mean? But I'll take the $1 and I'll rule whoever I think is right or wrong. You are not allowed to do that. It's actually one of the 613 mitzvahs. You're not allowed to do that. Why? Ki hashochad ye'aver einei chachamim, because bribery, ye'aver, it blinds, einei chachamim, the eyes of those who are wise, v'yisalef divrei tzadikim, it corrupts the words of the righteous. Says Rabbi Wasserman, you're Moses. You're the most pious person, righteous person, and you're adjudicating a case between Reuven and Shimon. And Reuven gives you some bribery. How much bribery does Moses need to take for him to be disqualified and transgress this law? The answer is a shaveh pruta, a pruta's worth. What is a pruta? Pruta is the smallest coin of denomination back in biblical/Talmudic times. It's roughly 25 cents. With inflation, we'll call it 35 cents. So Reuven gives 35 cents to Moses. Moses is disqualified from adjudicating who's right and who's wrong, Reuven or Shimon. Why? Ki hashochad ye'aver einei chachamim, because bribery, it distorts the eyes of the wise. V'yisalef divrei tzadikim, it will corrupt the words of the righteous. Always remember this. This is the most important lesson in all of human psychology. We like to think that we're robots. We like to think that when we make judgments in the world, we use our brains. It's our intellect. We're intellectually driven. If I want to make a decision between right and wrong, moral and immoral, just and unjust, Reuven and Shimon, well, my brain is like a computer. It's like a machine. And I just put all the information in, and I'm going to compute it, I'm going to crunch it, and I'm going to come up with my solution. Recognize that is not how humans work on the most fundamental of levels. Because what we're not failing to consider is the fact that Danny Kahneman would write and earn the Nobel Prize for. There's something called human biases. Human biases. You see, we all have cravings, rages, passions, urges, frustrations, things that we want, things that we don't want. We are all human with many, many, many complicated drives. And those things pull at our judgment. They cloud our judgment. Not consciously, but subconsciously. You're trying to figure out, you're starving, you haven't eaten all day, and someone gives you some food, and it's questionable whether it's kosher or not. I'm not sure, whatever the situation is. Well, what's going to happen? Because you're so hungry, you're like, it's good, it's fine, I'm sure it's good. Right? What would happen if you weren't hungry? You would view that situation very differently. And maybe you'd be like, you know what? I think I'm going to hold off. Why? What about your brain being so calculated and mechanical? The answer is your brain was influenced by your belly, which was rumbling. And always remember, we are influenced by what we want the world to look like. Once upon a time, there was a baseball game. Guy hits a ground ball. So third baseman dives to field the grounder, gets to his feet, throws across the diamond. It's a bang, bang play at first base, right? The runner right there, right when the throw comes in. The umpire says he's out. He's out. The first baseman turns to the ump and he says, what are you, blind? He was safe by a mile. How did you miss such an obvious call? The batter, first base, he turns to the first baseman. What are you? You're nuts. I was out by a mile. The managers come out, start fighting, and a brawl. The bench is clear. Right? That has never happened in the history of baseball. Why? Now, it could be, one answer is because you'd always, right? You would lie. Much more than that. Because when you're the first baseman and there's a bang, bang play at the plate, you think you're safe. Why? Because you want to be safe. And the first baseman thinks he's out. Why? Because he wants him to be out. Why? Because we have biases. It is impossible to look at the world and just come up with an objective reality. And we think we're computers. We think we make judgments that are cold, cool, calm, and collected. It's not true. Our wants, desires, passions, urges, cravings, rages, our humanity pulls at our ability to make judgments. That's what the Torah is saying. If you're a judge on a court case, if Reuven gives you $1, you are now biased. You are now going to push, maybe very ever so lightly, but you are going to be pushing and pulling a little bit towards Reuven. You are disqualified, even for 10 cents. And you're the most pious person in the world. Says Rabbi Wasserman, this starting point isn't, is there a God? Is there no God? Any person, if you just stop and look at the world around you, if you take for a moment and you just look at the world, of course there's a God. Yes, there's an expectation that a 13-year-old, a 12-year-old should believe in a God. Why? It's not complicated. It's actually a very obvious thing. You look at creation, you look at the majesty, you look at the harmony of the world. It doesn't take a lot to recognize that there is a Borei Olam, that there is a creator. The question is the opposite. Not how do we have an expectation of a 12 and 13-year-old to believe in God. The question is the other way. How do we understand how a brilliant person like Jefferson can miss such an obvious point? And says Rabbi Wasserman, I'll tell you, it's called a bias. We like to think that someone as smart as Thomas Jefferson will just have a cool, collected, rational, approach. There's God, no God, yes God, no God. That's not how it works. That's just not how it works. Jefferson, we know one thing about Thomas Jefferson. One thing we know very, very clearly about Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's fundamental difficulty can be explained simply. He was a passionate idealist, to some extent indeed an intellectual Puritan, but at the same time, a Sybarite. Now, I didn't know what a Sybarite meant, so I Googled it. A Sybarite means a person who is self-indulgent. An art lover and a fastidious devotee of all of life's luxuries. From claret to concubinage, there was no delight he did not sample, or rather indulge in habitually. He writes farther, Jefferson's temptations were more complex than most of his peers, for in addition to French wines, brandies, liquors, and cheeses, hams and pâtés, vintage port from Bristol, coats and shirts from Savile Row, and porcelain from Wedgwood and Dalton, there were endless books, some of them very expensive, accumulating to form the finest library, 15,000 volumes. Jefferson was an overly indulgent person. That we know. That is a truth about Jefferson. Jefferson loved things. He loved chasing women. He loved chasing money. He loved chasing certain types of fame. It's not a question. How can a guy like that, not believe in God? I'll tell you, because when you believe in God, you realize that you probably need to regulate your behavior. There's probably a right way and a wrong way how to live your life. Jefferson doesn't want to think like that, because that means he's going to have to reconsider all of his habits and indulgences. The easiest way, everyone has their theory to explain Jefferson. I think the most obvious, or not most obvious, I think actually the correct answer is what Rabbi Wasserman tells us. Biases. He had many, we call in Musar, negiyas. He had many biases. Those biases blinded him. He doesn't want to think about God. He doesn't want to see God. If he sees God, guess what? He shouldn't be living with Sally Hemings. Guess what? If you believe in God, maybe having all those slaves is probably not the right thing to do. Believing in God would pull against his lifestyle. And my guess and my speculation is that it's his very biases, these same negiyas, are probably how he explained all of his contradictions and complexities. When we have biases, when there are things pulling at our judgments, we can fardradle, we can come up with explanations for anything. How you can believe in being such a moralist, but at the same time, live with functionally a concubine. You say it's different, this isn't quite the same, it's separate, it's not the same thing. How can you go ahead and talk about how evil slavery is, yet buy, sell, and trade slaves your whole life? I'm different, it doesn't apply to me. When you are biased, particularly because you're such an indulgent person, you'll come up with all sorts of crazy answers to justify your behavior. Thomas Jefferson, in my opinion, is the greatest example of the koach hanegia, the power of biases. Biases distort our lives. Biases cloud our judgments. And biases allow us to live very complicated and contradictory lives. That is my opinion and my theory, and I think I'm right, of Thomas Jefferson. I want to thank you all for coming. Hope you all come again to future classes, and if anyone has any other questions, I'm here to stick around. Thank you all.